Imagine waking up every day, living your life with the certainty that nothing could ever disrupt your routine. Now, imagine that the one person you trusted, loved, and built a life with was suddenly taken away from you in a way you could never have prepared for. But the twist? They didn't die. They vanished, only to reappear years later with a new family, leaving you to grapple with the haunting truth. This was the reality for Eric Matthews, a man who spent 22 years in prison for the murder of his wife, Jennifer. The crime had rocked the small town of Oakdale. Jennifer had been found dead in their home, her body left in a pool of blood. Eric, her devoted husband, was convicted of the crime based on circumstantial evidence. His life was stolen from him in the blink of an eye, as he was sent behind bars, sentenced to life for a crime he swore he didn't commit. For 2 decades, Eric sat in a prison cell, replaying the details of that fateful night in his mind. The investigators said it was a clear case, an argument turned deadly. Yet, Eric's mind never allowed him to believe it. He had been a good husband. He loved Jennifer. So why was he blamed for her death? The pain of losing her and the conviction that something wasn't right gnawed at him every day. As years passed, he never stopped fighting to prove his innocence, sending letters, hiring lawyers, and even contacting private investigators. Then one day Eric got the news. New evidence had surfaced and his conviction was overturned. The years of uncertainty, the unrelenting doubts, were suddenly replaced with the hope of freedom. But nothing could have prepared him for the truth that would come to light. The woman he had believed to be dead, his wife Jennifer, was alive. And not just alive, but living a completely new life with a new husband, children, and an entirely different identity. The woman he had spent over 2 decades mourning had been living in hiding, her murder faked. And now, 5 years after his release, Eric was about to see her again. But this time, it wasn't the reunion he had hoped for. For 22 years, Eric Matthews lived a life in limbo. A life where time was marked not by the changing seasons, but by the concrete walls of a prison cell. Every day, every moment was a reminder that the woman he loved, his wife Jennifer, was gone. And yet, in the deep recesses of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being punished for a crime he didn't commit. Eric Matthews had always been a man of stability. A man who worked hard, loved his wife, and kept a steady job as a high school teacher. He was the kind of man everyone trusted. The neighbor who mowed his lawn every Sunday, the husband who always remembered anniversaries. Jennifer and Eric's life seemed perfect on the surface. They had plans, dreams, and a future. But all that was shattered in one violent night. The night Jennifer was found dead remains etched in Eric's memory. It had started like any other evening, quiet, uneventful. They had dinner, laughed over trivial matters, and went to bed. But sometime in the early hours of the morning, something went horribly wrong. Jennifer's body was discovered in their home, brutally murdered, and Eric was the prime suspect. The police found evidence that pointed to him, bloodstains, fingerprints, and a supposed argument that neighbors had overheard. It was a case that seemed airtight. The trial was swift. Eric maintained his innocence, but the prosecution painted a picture of a crime of passion. A man enraged over a secret, a man who snapped and killed the one person he loved. The jury was convinced, and in a courtroom filled with tension, Eric Matthews was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His life as he knew it was over. Prison was an entirely new world for Eric. He was no longer the teacher, the husband, the man with a future. He was a convicted murderer. The first days were the hardest. The shock of the conviction, the isolation, and the overwhelming fear of the unknown weighed on him. He had to adjust to a new identity, one that was nothing like the man he had been. The cold, harsh reality of life behind bars stripped him of his dignity, but it also forged a new strength in him. Eric's time in prison wasn't just about surviving, it was about fighting for redemption. He spent countless hours reading, studying law, and writing letters to anyone who might help him prove his innocence. He became his own lawyer, filing motions, appealing his case, and never letting go of the belief that one day the truth would come out. His nights were filled with nightmares of Jennifer's death, and his days were consumed by the pursuit of justice. He was determined to clear his name, even if it meant spending the rest of his life behind bars. Despite the darkness of prison life, Eric formed connections that would keep him going. He became close with a group of inmates who understood his plight. Some were guilty, some were innocent, but they shared a common bond: time. They had all been sentenced to lives of uncertainty. The camaraderie between them provided Eric with a sense of purpose. And yet, through it all, the thought of Jennifer, alive or dead, was always with him. Her memory was his driving force. The murder of Jennifer Matthews was a crime that shook the town to its core. In Oakdale, a place where nothing ever seemed out of place, a brutal killing was enough to rattle even the most hardened residents. But what made it even more devastating was the fact that the man accused of the crime was someone they all knew: a beloved teacher, a neighbor, and, in their eyes, a husband driven by passion. But what if the real story was much darker than anyone could have imagined? The evening Jennifer Matthews died started like so many others in the Matthews household: calm, comfortable, and filled with the quiet hum of domestic life. But just a few hours later, their seemingly perfect world was torn apart. No one heard the struggle. No one saw what happened behind the closed doors of their home. What they did know, however, was that Jennifer's body was discovered in the early hours of the morning. The police arrived to a scene that would forever haunt the town: a bloody crime scene, a brutal murder, and a husband who had no alibi. The evidence that the police presented in court seemed almost too perfect, too convenient. Blood stains near the bedroom. A broken lamp. A 911 call from Jennifer's phone that never came through to the emergency dispatcher. And perhaps most damning of all, Eric Matthews' fingerprints were found on the murder weapon. With these pieces in place, the case seemed airtight. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone else at the scene, and no explanation as to why Jennifer would have been killed by a stranger. The trial that followed was quick, the prosecution's case built on these seemingly irrefutable pieces of evidence. Eric, still in shock from the loss of his wife, found himself at the center of a nightmare. The pain of losing Jennifer was unbearable, but to be accused of her murder, of being the very person who had taken her life, was a horror that no one could have prepared for. His defense team tried to argue his innocence, but the public opinion was already formed. Eric Matthews was guilty in the eyes of the world. As the trial progressed, Eric found himself trapped in a maze of conflicting emotions. He was overcome by grief and guilt. How could he be accused of murdering the woman he had loved for so many years? The police and media painted him as the perfect villain. His supposed rage, jealousy, and uncontrollable emotions were put on display for everyone to see. He was the perfect suspect in a crime that seemed too personal to be anything but a crime of passion. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. In a small, quiet courtroom with the weight of his life hanging in the balance, Eric Matthews was found guilty of first-degree murder. The words "guilty as charged" echoed in Eric's ears, but they didn't make sense. How could they? He had never killed Jennifer. The woman he had spent years with, built a life with, she was gone. And yet, here he was, shackled and sentenced to life behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of the reality sank in. His life, his future was over. And yet, something inside Eric refused to believe it. Deep down, he knew he didn't kill Jennifer. He couldn't. But if that was true, then who did? For Oakdale, the impact of Jennifer Matthews' murder was profound. The town's peaceful, idyllic image was forever tainted by the violent crime. Jennifer was well loved, a member of the community who had worked tirelessly for charity events, school functions, and local outreach programs. Her death left a hole in the town that could never be filled. And for Eric, being the man accused of her murder only compounded the tragedy. Friends turned away, neighbors whispered, and even his closest colleagues began to question his innocence. The once perfect life he had lived with Jennifer seemed like a distant dream. But behind the sadness, the anger, and the confusion, Eric clung to one truth: he had not killed Jennifer. That belief would become the foundation of his survival in prison. It was the only thing that kept him going in those long, dark years. He had to know the truth. And one day he promised himself he would uncover it. Life behind bars is a different kind of death. It's not just the loss of freedom, but the loss of identity, the crushing weight of regret, and the gnawing uncertainty of a future that feels like it will never come. For Eric Matthews, prison wasn't just a place of confinement, It was where he lived in the shadow of his wife's death, haunted by the question, why had she been taken from him? Eric Matthews walked into prison a man who had just lost everything. His wife, his life, his future, taken away in an instant. But as the prison gates slammed shut behind him, something else also disappeared. His sense of identity. The man who had once been a teacher, a husband, a member of a tight-knit community, was now just another inmate. He was nothing but a number in a system that didn't care about who he was or what he'd lost. The first few days were the hardest. Everything was unfamiliar. The clang of the cell doors, the coldness of the concrete walls, the harsh, unyielding lights that never dimmed. The overwhelming sense of isolation threatened to swallow him whole. Eric's thoughts were consumed by Jennifer. He replayed every detail of their life together, every moment that had led to that terrible night. In prison, there was no escape from the grief, the self-doubt, and the feeling that the world had turned its back on him. Prison is a place where survival doesn't just mean living, it means holding on to something that makes life worth enduring. For Eric, that something was the truth. He knew in his heart that he hadn't killed Jennifer. The trial, the conviction, the judgment, they didn't define him. He refused to let them. He couldn't. Every night, as the prison lights flickered off and the sounds of distant doors closing echoed through the hallways, Eric made a silent promise to himself. He would find a way to prove his innocence. He began to study. The prison library became his sanctuary. Law books, legal journals, case studies, anything he could get his hands on. He devoured them all. Every free moment, Eric worked on his case, teaching himself the intricacies of the law, filing motions, researching precedents, and crafting letters to lawyers, journalists, and anyone who might help him. His obsession with proving his innocence became his lifeline. Despite the cold, harsh environment, Eric found unexpected friendships. Prison wasn't just about survival, it was also about trust. He formed bonds with fellow inmates who were in for crimes both small and horrific. Some were guilty, some were not, but they all shared one thing in common: time. Time had stripped them of everything, and now they had nothing but each other. In the prison's underworld, Eric was able to find camaraderie and even kindness. These were the men who understood him the most. Men who had been judged, who had been wronged, who had lost everything. It was in this environment that Eric began to rebuild himself, not just as a man, but as someone who would fight to reclaim his future. The guilt and sadness that had once consumed him were replaced by a new determination. He knew that if he ever had a chance to walk free again, he had to do everything in his power to prove that he had been wrongfully convicted. But even as he worked tirelessly on his case, Eric couldn't escape the reminders of the life he had lost. The other inmates had their own families, visitors who came to see them, letters from home. Eric's family had all but abandoned him. His parents, unable to bear the weight of the accusations, had stopped visiting years ago. His friends, the ones who had once been his closest confidants, no longer wrote. The silence from the outside world was deafening. But there were still moments of hope. Every letter he received from his lawyer, every new legal document he read, gave him the sense that the walls weren't as high as they seemed. Each day in prison was a day closer to the truth, a day closer to freedom. Eric didn't know when it would come, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday he would walk out of this place and he would find out who killed Jennifer. He would find out what really happened on that fateful night. Prison had become a mirror for Eric. It reflected not just the mistakes he had made, but the mistakes that had been made in the world outside. It showed him the difference between guilt and justice, between punishment and redemption. Every day in that small cell, with the haunting memory of Jennifer's death pressing down on him, Eric learned more about himself than he had in all the years before. He learned that freedom wasn't just about walking out of a prison cell, it was about finding peace with the truth. Hook. Eric Matthews had spent 22 long years behind bars, believing in his heart that the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. He had lived through the endless days of solitude, convinced that one day someone would listen. What he didn't expect was that the truth would come from the most unlikely place. A single letter, a small piece of evidence that would shatter everything he thought he knew. It had been 5 years since Eric's release from prison. The shock of stepping back into the world that had moved on without him was still fresh. But he had begun to rebuild, focusing on the one thing that had kept him alive for all those years: finding the truth behind Jennifer's death. His life was now defined by one singular purpose: to understand why she had been killed, and why he had been framed for a crime he didn't commit. Then, out of nowhere came a breakthrough. A private investigator, a young woman named Hannah, had been hired by a legal nonprofit to look into cold cases. She had heard about Eric's case, the man who had been wrongfully convicted of his wife's murder. She reached out to him with the startling news. New evidence had surfaced and the case was being reopened. At first, Eric couldn't believe it. For years he had fought alone, pushing for justice, only to be met with silence. Now someone was finally listening. But what could this new evidence be? What had been overlooked for all these years? As Eric sat across from Hannah in her office, the truth began to take shape. A previously overlooked piece of surveillance footage from the night of Jennifer's death had surfaced. The footage didn't show Eric leaving the house that night as the police had assumed. It showed someone else, a man who had slipped into the house quietly, moving like a shadow. This man wasn't Eric. This was a new piece of the puzzle. But that wasn't the most shocking part. As Hannah dug deeper, she uncovered another chilling detail. Jennifer was alive. She hadn't died that night. It wasn't a murder, it was a well-crafted lie. Jennifer had faked her own death, and in doing so, she had framed Eric for the crime. The news hit Eric like a freight train. His mind raced as he tried to process the implications. Jennifer, his wife, was alive. She had betrayed him in a way that no one could have predicted. The woman he had spent years grieving, the woman whose memory had been his driving force for so long, had staged her own death and left him to rot in prison. But why? Why had Jennifer done this to him? The answers weren't easy to come by, but slowly, Eric began to piece together the events leading up to that fateful night. Jennifer had been living a double life. While Eric was in prison, she had built a new identity for herself. She had a new name, a new life, and a new family, one that Eric had never known about. As the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that Jennifer had been involved in a secret affair with another man. Not just any man, but a wealthy businessman who had promised to take her away from the life she had with Eric. The man had money, power, and a vision for a new life that Jennifer couldn't resist. They had planned to fake her death, framing Eric for the murder, and starting fresh somewhere far away. Eric had been nothing more than a pawn in her game, a man she had once loved but was willing to sacrifice for her own escape. The depth of her betrayal was staggering. Not only had she ruined his life, but she had also orchestrated a lie so elaborate that it had taken decades to unravel. Eric was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, confusion, and disbelief. How could Jennifer have done this to him? The woman he had trusted, who had been his partner in life, had deceived him so completely that even now, 5 years after her disappearance, he was struggling to understand it all. But amid the anger and betrayal, there was a quiet realization. Eric finally knew the truth. And with that truth came a sense of clarity, albeit one tainted with deep sorrow. He had been wronged, but now he had the evidence he needed to clear his name, to prove to the world that he was innocent. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was the only path that mattered now, the path toward justice. The moment Eric laid eyes on Jennifer again, it felt as if time had stopped. There she was, standing across the room, not the woman he remembered, but someone entirely different. Someone who had betrayed him beyond comprehension. But even as anger flared inside him, he couldn't deny the pain that surged within him. She was alive, but the woman he had mourned was no longer the same. It had been 5 years since Eric had been released from prison. His life, though not perfect, had begun to settle into a semblance of normalcy. But the meeting that had been set up by the private investigator, Hannah, was something Eric had both dreaded and longed for. He had to see Jennifer, hear her explanation, and finally confront the woman who had destroyed his life. The meeting was arranged in a small, neutral location, an upscale cafe on the edge of town, chosen for its anonymity and safety. Eric wasn't sure what he expected, but the reality was far worse than he had imagined. As Eric stepped into the cafe, his heart raced. He could feel the weight of every year spent in prison bearing down on him, the years of uncertainty, the years of grief, all pushing him toward this moment. And then, across the room, he saw her. Jennifer. She looked different, of course. Time had passed and she had changed. But it wasn't just the passing of years that made her unrecognizable. It was the absence of the warmth he had once known in her eyes. The Jennifer he had loved was gone, replaced by someone cold, calculated, and distant. Jennifer stood up as Eric walked toward her. Their eyes locked for a moment, and in that instant, 1,000 unspoken words seemed to hang between them. Eric could feel his pulse quicken, his body tense with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He had dreamt of this moment for so long, but now that it was here, he didn't know where to start. Jennifer, he said, his voice a low whisper, barely audible over the noise of the cafe. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. Eric, but she didn't finish. She didn't need to. There was nothing she could say to undo what she had done. Eric took a seat, his eyes never leaving her face. "I never thought I'd see you again. I never thought you'd be here in front of me after everything you did." Jennifer's face remained stoic, emotionless. She seemed cold, detached, as though she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "I'm sorry, Eric. I truly am," she said, but the apology felt hollow, like it had no weight behind it. "I never wanted you to go through what you did. But I had no choice." Eric leaned forward, his fists clenched. The words that had been building in his mind for years finally spilled out. "No choice? You had no choice but to leave me in prison for 22 years? You had no choice but to destroy my life." His voice cracked with emotion, and for a brief moment he was back in the prison cell, reliving the isolation, the anger, the betrayal. Jennifer sighed deeply, as if carrying the burden of a confession she could no longer avoid. "I didn't think it would end like this, Eric. I didn't plan for everything to go wrong. At first it was just an escape. I felt trapped in a life that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted more. More freedom, more excitement. And then I met someone who could give me that." Eric's heart sank. He knew who she was talking about, the man who had been behind it all, the man who had promised her a new life. "So, that's it? You faked your death, framed me for murder, and ran off to live your life with someone else." The pain in Eric's voice was palpable, and for a moment Jennifer's facade cracked, but only for a moment. "I didn't think you would suffer as much as you did," Jennifer continued. I thought I could just disappear and everything would be fine. But I was wrong. I didn't realize how deep it would cut. You were never supposed to be caught up in this." Eric could feel his heart tearing in two as he listened to her words. They were the same words he had heard in the prison cells, words that sought to justify an action that had irrevocably changed his life. Jennifer's apology seemed to come from a place of regret, but it didn't undo the damage. It didn't erase the 22 years he had lost, the years of pain, the years of wondering if he had truly been guilty. The betrayal felt even deeper now. It wasn't just the loss of Jennifer. It was the loss of everything he had known about love, about trust, about who he was. The man who had entered prison, the man who had been so sure of his life, was no longer the same. That man was gone. And in his place was a man who had been broken, reshaped by the lies and the deception. As they sat there, facing each other, Eric realized that he could never get back what he had lost. Jennifer, the woman he had once loved, had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. And now, even with the truth before him, there was nothing left but the hollow feeling of finality. As Eric sat across from Jennifer, her words echoed in his mind, but they weren't enough to fill the emptiness he felt. Her apology, her justifications, they didn't change what had been done. Now it was time to dig deeper, to find the truth that had been buried for so long. Who was Jennifer really? What had driven her to deceive not only him but everyone who had ever known her? Jennifer's story, though chilling, had one glaring omission: the real reason behind her decision to fake her death. She spoke about wanting more freedom, about feeling trapped in a life that no longer made her happy. But that didn't explain everything. The deeper Eric dug, the more he realized how calculated this had been, how long she had been planning it. It wasn't just the affair that had pushed Jennifer to leave. No, it was much darker than that. As Eric pored over the documents Hannah had found, the full extent of Jennifer's deception began to emerge. Jennifer had a hidden side, one that had been carefully concealed behind the mask of the loving wife, the devoted partner. She wasn't just seeking escape, she was involved in something far more dangerous and manipulative. The first clue came in the form of a series of financial transactions, ones that Eric had never seen before. Jennifer had been draining their bank accounts, transferring large sums of money to offshore accounts in the months leading up to her death. It wasn't just about escaping her marriage, it was about securing her future with her new life, with the man she had been seeing behind Eric's back. Jennifer had used Eric as a pawn in a much bigger game. She had manipulated his love for her, her charm and affection serving as the perfect cover for her true motives. And the most painful realization for Eric? She had used him to clean out their joint accounts, to make sure that when she disappeared, she had everything she needed to start anew without a trace. The other man in Jennifer's life, David Wallace, wasn't just an affair partner. He was a key player in her plan. Jennifer had met him years ago, someone she had met through mutual friends. He was wealthy, influential, and had his own dark secrets. Together, they had plotted Jennifer's fake death, ensuring that Eric would take the fall for the crime she had orchestrated. David had connections that allowed them to manipulate evidence, fabricate a crime scene, and disappear without anyone suspecting a thing. Eric's heart sank as he realized the full scope of the betrayal. The affair wasn't just a lapse in judgment, It was part of a calculated effort to escape her life with him, to assume a new identity and take everything she could from their shared years. Eric had been a mere stepping stone in her pursuit of a better life, and that truth stung more than anything. The lies stretched beyond money and infidelity. Jennifer had been telling lies to everyone, friends, family, and even herself. She had created a new identity, one that allowed her to live without the consequences of the life she had abandoned. When Eric had tried to contact her after his release, she had blocked his calls, avoided his messages, and completely erased her existence from his life. But now, as Eric dug through the remains of their life together, the full extent of her deception began to surface. Jennifer had been living in plain sight all these years, using her new identity to build a family with David and, eventually, the children they had together. They had a life, one that was built on a lie that Eric had been blind to for far too long. Eric's heart burned with a mix of anger and disbelief. How could Jennifer do this to him? How could she have destroyed his life, stolen his future, and left him to rot in prison while she walked free? The realization that the woman he had once loved had crafted such an elaborate lie made him question everything he had ever known about her. All the years of devotion, the love they had shared, none of it had been real. As he looked at the evidence in front of him, Eric felt an overwhelming need to confront Jennifer once again. This time he wasn't just seeking answers. He was seeking justice. The truth was no longer just something he needed to understand, it was something he had to expose. The world had to know what she had done. She couldn't get away with this any longer. The truth was out. Jennifer had betrayed Eric in ways he couldn't have imagined. But even with the veil of deception lifted, the damage had been done. Eric had spent years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and now, facing Jennifer in the harsh light of truth, he was forced to confront not just her betrayal, but the lasting impact of everything that had happened. After the revelation, Eric felt as though he was walking through a fog. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung, it was the realization that Jennifer had stolen so much more than just his life. She had stolen his sense of self. For 2 decades, Eric had been locked away in prison, believing that he was guilty, believing that he had somehow failed Jennifer. But now, knowing that everything had been a lie, Eric struggled to reconcile the man he was in prison with the man he was now. The anger he felt was palpable. The years of lost time, the friendships that had withered, the relationships that had crumbled, all of it felt like it had been for nothing. The community that had once loved and supported him now turned their backs. Some believed he was guilty, others were just too scared to confront the truth. His reputation had been tainted, and even though he had been freed from prison, Eric knew that the damage to his life was irreparable. Jennifer, on the other hand, had seemingly moved on. With her new family, her new identity, she had rebuilt a life that was unrecognizable to Eric. The man she had once called her husband had become a ghost to her. There was no remorse in her eyes when they met. No sense of regret. She had found happiness again, in the arms of David and the children they had together. And that was the hardest part for Eric to accept. While he had lost everything, Jennifer had gained everything she wanted. Her betrayal wasn't just a personal wound, it had become a public one. The way she had manipulated the system, the people around her, and even Eric's own mind for so long was nothing short of criminal. But what hurt Eric the most was the fact that she had continued on as if nothing had ever happened. She had built a new family, a new future, while he had been left in the ashes of their past. As Eric processed the truth, he realized that he wasn't just grieving the loss of Jennifer, he was grieving the loss of the life he thought they had shared. The idealized memories of their time together had been shattered, leaving him with only fragments of what had been. The overwhelming question that plagued his mind was, how could he ever move on from this? Forgiveness seemed impossible. How could he forgive the woman who had sentenced him to 22 years in prison? How could he forgive her for taking away his life, his future, and everything he had worked for? But despite the anger and bitterness, Eric knew that holding on to this pain wasn't the answer. In a way, the truth had given him a new kind of freedom. It wasn't freedom from the past, it was freedom from the lies. While the truth had been revealed, Eric's journey was far from over. The legal battles to hold Jennifer accountable for her actions were just beginning. The pain of those lost years could never be fully erased, but with the truth on his side, Eric felt a new sense of purpose. It was time to rebuild his life, to find peace with what had happened, and to ensure that Jennifer's betrayal was never forgotten. Eric's fight wasn't just about seeking justice for himself. It was about making sure that others who had been wronged would never have to live in the shadows of lies. And though the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, he knew one thing: he would no longer let the past define him. The journey from betrayal to justice is never simple. For Eric Matthews, it wasn't just about the years he had spent in prison or the life he had lost, it was about coming to terms with the truth, no matter how painful it was. In the end, the path to healing wasn't paved with revenge or anger, but with the hard-earned realization that moving forward required forgiveness, strength, and a commitment to reclaiming his life. Eric's journey had come full circle. He had spent years imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, his life stolen by a woman he loved and trusted. But as he sat in the quiet of his small apartment, the truth finally in his hands, Eric realized that justice wasn't just about exposing the lies, it was about reclaiming the pieces of himself that had been lost along the way. The woman he had loved for so long, Jennifer, had deceived him in the most profound way possible. Yet, as the years went on, Eric began to understand that holding on to the rage and pain wasn't going to bring him peace. He had suffered enough, and the truth, no matter how painful, had given him the freedom to finally let go. The fight for justice wasn't over. Eric knew that the legal system had to hold Jennifer accountable for her actions. But the battle was no longer just about him, it was about ensuring that the people who were wronged by the system, by lies and deception, had their voices heard. In many ways, Eric had become a symbol of resilience. He had endured, and now, with the truth on his side, he was ready to face the future. Eric knew that rebuilding his life wouldn't be easy. The emotional scars would remain, and the world would always remember the man who had been wrongfully convicted of his wife's murder. But the one thing that would never be taken from him again was his own sense of truth. He had fought for it, he had earned it, and now he would use it to rebuild his future. As for Jennifer, Eric could never fully understand what had driven her to such extreme measures. The betrayal, the lies, the years of pain, those wounds would never completely heal. But through it all, Eric had found a new sense of self. He had survived the worst, and in doing so, he had discovered a strength he never knew he had. And though forgiveness would take time, he knew that in order to truly move forward, he had to let go of the past. For the first time in years, Eric saw a future ahead of him. A future where he could begin to heal, where he could rebuild what had been taken from him. The truth had set him free, and though the journey had been long and fraught with pain, Eric Matthews was ready to embrace the life that had been stolen from him.